Please be seated. Good afternoon. We're back on the record. Sir, council want to approach for just one moment. Are we ready to bring the jury back in?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. State.
Yes, Your Honor.
Jury's present, Your Honor.
Please be seated. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. And while you're getting your notes together, I'm going to ask you my questions. If your answer is yes to any of the questions, please raise your hand. During the lunch recess, did any of you have any discussions amongst yourselves or with anybody else about the case? No hands are being raised. Did any of you read or listen to any radio, television, or newspaper reports about the case? No hands are being raised. Did any of you use any type of an electronic device to get on the internet to do independent research about the case, people, places, things, or terminology? No hands are being raised. And finally, did any of you read or create any emails, text messages, Twitters, tweets, blogs, or social networking pages about the case? No hands are being raised. Thank you. Mr. O'Mara, call your next witness, please.
The defense would call Doris Singleton, Your Honor.
You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, ma'am. How are you?
I'm sorry?
I said, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Thank
Great.
you.
And I guess you were just sworn back in, but you've testified here before the jury before, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So let me focus you after you had a conversation where you took an initial statement from Mr. Zimmerman. We talked about that in your initial testimony, correct?
We did.
And then you were also present with Chief Investigator Serino when he was doing some of his workup, including a second statement taken from my client. Remember that?
Yes, I remember. I was there.
Okay. Was there a time that you were present where Investigator Serino was meeting with Tracy Martin?
Yes, I was there when he was meeting with Tracy Martin.
If you would, tell the jury the circumstances surrounding that.
Your Honor, I'm going to object. This calls for hearsay, and we can approach the bench for
Yes, you may approach.
Singleton, we were at the point, I think, where you were telling us about an event with Officer Serino and Tracy Martin. Remember that?
Yes, I do remember that.
Okay. I think the last question was, can you tell us sort of the setting, sort of give us an outlay of how things were when you were there?
Okay, I believe it was 2 days after the incident that Trayvon was shot, and Tracy Martin was there to speak to Chris Serino, and he was concerned that arrest hadn't been made, and Chris Serino was trying to explain to him the circumstances of the way.
Your Honor, I would not be offering Officer Serino's statements as, for the truth of the matter, sort of rather laying out the foundation. I think that's an exception to the hearsay rule. I'm not going to get into what I'm speaking, and I apologize.
Okay. She could testify as to what she has observed and what the circumstances were, but not as to what anybody said. Not as to what anybody said?
Including the other officer? Because if then I would need to be heard at the bench for that, Your Honor. I know the limitation we talked about already, just not that one.
Well, go ahead and ask your question, and I'll wait for an objection.
Okay, thank you. I think you were saying then sort of the setting, so if you would continue.
Okay, the setting was in the office cubicles at one, and it was sitting, they were both sitting at Chris Serino's desk, Chris in his own seat, in an extra chair that had been brought over to Chris's desk so that Tracy Martin could sit. I believe it was his girlfriend that was with him. And they were there so that Chris Serino could explain to them why, at this point, an arrest couldn't be made.
Okay. And it was your understanding that Investigator Serino was still in the beginning stages of the investigation, is that correct?
Yes, I believe it was either 2 or 3 days after the incident.
And where were you sitting or standing while this conversation was occurring?
I was sitting probably diagonal to the cubicles. The cubicles are set in a square, and there's a path between them that you can walk through, and then there's a hall. And I was basically in the hall. It's not really a hall, but it's where the cubicles would end before there's another wall that actually has offices that are walled. So I was probably about 8 or 10 feet from his desk.
Okay. And did there come a time then that Investigator Sereno played what we now know to be the Lauer 911 call for Mr. Tracy Martin and his girlfriend to listen to?
Yes, he played it for them.
And do you recall if it was played once or more than once?
I recall it was played once. I'm not sure if it was played more than that.
And without telling us the verbal response, what did Mr. Martin do in response to listening to the call?
Fair objection, Your Honor. Calls for
Well,
hearsay.
She could describe what she saw, but not what she heard.
You understand hearsay, right? And what you can and can't say. So I'm not asking you to tell us what Mr. Martin said, but I am asking you to give an observation as to his physical response.
He was very upset. He was very sad. He hung his head, he cried.
And did he give a response to Officer Sereno?
Yes.
The next question I think might be objectionable for record purposes, Your Honor. What did Mr. Martin say in response to the question by Mr. Sereno as to whether or not that was his son's voice?
Fair objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
And I have no further questions for this witness right now, Your Honor, though the state may have some.
No questions?
Okay, thank you. May Officer Singleton be excused? May Officer Singleton be excused?
I'll need her to be recalled potentially as we go through the next couple
Okay.
of witnesses. Your
You're
Honor.
subject to being recalled, so please stay in the building. You're excused from the courtroom. Call
Yes,
your
ma'am.
next witness, please.
We'll call Chris Sereno, Your Honor. Officer Chris Sereno. He's in the building, Your Honor. I believe he's on the floor. May I approach him, Your Honor?
Yes, you may. Okay, Officer Serino, can we get him in court, please?
Would you raise your right hand? You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
You may proceed.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, sir.
Of course, you testified here before the jury before today, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you're placed back under oath, so your testimony will be as well, testimony under oath. We had begun a conversation with your last testimony that talked about the ongoing investigation that you were in charge of regarding this case. You were the chief investigating officer, correct?
Yes, sir.
Did there come a time that you met with Tracy Martin and his girlfriend, Brandy Green, in your office?
Yes, sir, there was.
Do you recall about how many days after the event of the shooting that was?
It was either the day after or the day after the walkthrough. I think it was on the 28th.
Okay. What was the purpose of you bringing Mr. Martin and Miss Green to your office?
To bring him up to speed as far as the progress of the investigation and where we were at that point.
Okay. They had some concerns, did they not, as to whether or not Mrs. Zimmerman at that point had been arrested?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And were you sharing with them your progress and what was done and what still needed to be done?
Yes, sir.
And can you outline the setting where you were when you had this conversation with the two of them?
We conducted a meeting in the conference room that we have in the police department on the second floor. And and after that, I went ahead and played the 911 recordings for him.
Okay, do you recall where that recording, playing of that recording took place?
It was at my desk.
Okay. And that was, as testified to by a previous officer, sort of a cubby hole set up with 2 or 3 other desks in the close proximity?
Yes, sir.
And can you then tell the jury how that was set up, where you were sitting, where Mr. Martin was sitting if he was, and where Ms. Green was sitting?
Okay, I was seated in front of my desk facing my computer monitor. Mr. Martin was to my rear left, and next to him was his girlfriend or fiancée, Brandy, and kind of like in that posture.
Okay. So if I'm sitting at my screen right here, you were sitting down?
Yes, sir.
Tracy Martin then was just over your left shoulder?
Yes, sir.
And then Brandy Green just behind or next to him?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And what was the focus at that point?
The audio portions of the recording that I was playing on my computer.
Okay. We know, and I want to focus you on what we have shorthand called the Lauer 911 call. Do you understand what I mean by that?
Yes, sir.
And that is the call that has the screams on it and the gunshot?
Yes, sir.
And did you play that for Mr. Martin and Ms. Green?
Yes, sir. I played all the recordings for him.
Okay. Focusing on the 911 call, we just talked about the Lauer 911 call. Tell me how you played that, what volume, or how the setting of that occurred.
I can't recall the number as far as the volume went, but it was audible, relatively clear, as clear as I had. It was played off of I believe off of a CD. It might have been digital, an email. Don't quite remember, but it was played, and it was audible.
Okay. And what was Mr. Martin's response?
Emotional, understandably so, and I let him listen first.
I'm sorry?
I let him listen first before I asked anything.
Okay. And what did you ask him?
I believe my words were, is that your son's voice in the background? Or something. I think I said a little differently than that, but I inquired as if that was, in fact, his son yelling for help.
And what was his response?
It was more of a verbal and nonverbal. He looked away and under his breath, as I interpreted, said no.
Did he ever ask that the tape be played for him again that time?
I don't believe so.
Did he ever evidence to you any concern with being able to hear the tape?
No, sir.
Had that occurred, would you have simply played the tape for him a second time?
Absolutely, sir.
And Ms. Green, what was her response?
She was consoling him. I didn't hear a response from her.
Did you ask her specifically whether or not she believed it to be Trayvon Martin's voice?
No, sir, I did not.
Did she offer any opinion voluntarily as to whether or not she believed it was Trayvon Martin's voice?
None that I recall, no, sir.
Do you know who else was present in the area sort of nearby, within, let's say, earshot of the playing of the call?
One of our sergeants was behind us. He was walking through. I guess he saw what I was doing, and he took it upon himself to stop, and I believe that was the only person that I saw.
Do you recall what that sergeant's name was?
Sergeant Leon Ciesla.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you, Cross.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, sir.
Let's talk about the last thing you mentioned. Sergeant Ciesla was walking by, or you believe stopped, is that correct?
Yeah, I know he stopped, yes.
Okay, and Detective or Investigator Singleton wasn't around as best you can recall, is that correct?
No, sir.
She was not, correct?
No, I didn't see her there.
Okay. Now, I assume by the nature of your profession that this is one of the most difficult things you have to do,
By far, sir, yes, it is.
to have to talk about the death of a loved one to a parent.
Yes, sir, it was.
Is there anything more difficult that you have to deal with as an investigator in a case involving the death of a person?
Other than an initial notification, probably not.
And I gather you try to, as best you can, to be as sensitive as you can, realizing how sensitive this issue is, or how traumatic an event it can be, correct?
Yes, sir.
And did you attempt to do that as best you could?
Yes, sir, I did.
Okay. I gather you informed Trayvon Martin's dad that you were going to have him listen to some recordings?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Did you tell him ahead of time that there would actually be a shot? In other words, that he would actually listen to the death of his son? In other words, did you tell him ahead of time?
I don't recall specifically informing him of that, no.
Okay. But you played, I think you said 5 or 6 911 calls, is that correct?
Everyone that I had, yes, sir.
Okay. And at this time, do you recall the order or how you played them, other than you played them all?
I don't recall the order, but yes, I played them all.
And would you agree that some of those recordings, such as Ms. Serdika's, was gut-wrenching, in other words, for a parent to have to listen to when they're talking about the death of their son?
Yes, sir.
Okay, they were pretty emotional.
Yes, sir.
And would you agree that Mr. Martin's reaction was appropriate in the sense of having to relive that, even though he wasn't there, but having to, again, understand that his son was no longer among us? In other words, that his son was dead in heaven, hopefully.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and would you agree that he reacted appropriately to that?
Yes, sir.
So you played the recording in which Ms. Serdika is, and the jury's listened to him, so I'm not going to play it again, but she's describing the death of this kid, or describing what she heard, whatever it was. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And then you're playing other recordings in which other people are describing what they saw, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I gather as you're playing this, Mr. Martin's getting very emotional. Would that be fair?
Yes, sir.
Was he having a hard time dealing with this?
In my opinion, yes, sir.
Okay. And I gather he didn't say, hey, hold on, this is too difficult for me. Let me come back another day. He went ahead and said, I'm going to listen to everything, because he wanted to know what was going on in the case. Would that be fair?
Yes, sir.
And from your perspective, that was very understandable, correct?
Absolutely, yes,
I
sir.
mean, his son has been killed, 2 days earlier, correct?
Sir, yes.
And he's wanting some answers, as any parent should want. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
Wasn't that reasonable on his part?
Yes, sir, it was.
That next thing he knows, he gets home and his son's is missing, and then he realizes his son's dead.
Yes, sir.
And it's not just from natural causes. Somebody has shot him in the chest.
Let me object, Your Honor, outside the scope of direct examination.
I don't know, I think this is pertinent to the issue that I'm trying to establish, the scenario that Mr.
Well, then get to
Martin.
your next question, please.
Yes. In other words, did you preface any of this? I know this is going to be very difficult for you, but please try to listen to all these recordings. I'm assuming you did that because you're a police officer's been around the block a lot of times.
I believe I did, yes, sir.
Okay. And he, even though realizing it was going to be emotional, said, I'll try to listen through this and try to go through it?
Yes, sir, he did.
Okay. And as he's listening through this, is the emotion kind of building up? Do you see that building up?
It was a very emotional moment, yes, sir.
Okay. And then you played, at some point, the recording of the screams for help,
Yes, sir, I
correct?
did, yes.
But also in that recording, there's actually a gunshot, correct?
Yes, there is.
Okay. And I gather you played, as a good investigator, you played all the recordings from beginning to end, correct?
Yes, sir.
So that there would be no issue about what was going on, that you actually were thorough in your attempting to tell Mr. Martin what had happened.
My objective was to share all the information I had with him.
Okay. So you were providing all those recordings?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I gather he's listening to these cries and then he hears the gunshot, correct? And then
Yes,
you
sir.
keep playing it, right?
Yes, sir.
And I guess it was obvious in the way you were playing it that we were talking about his son having been shot.
Correct.
I mean,
Yes, sir.
was there any dispute about that?
No, sir, there was not.
That he understood that that was the death of his son?
Yes, sir.
And I gather you being as sensitive as you can based on these circumstances. Well, I'm assuming it was emotional for you too.
It was trying for me, yes, it was.
Okay. And obviously being a good investigator, police officer, having done this for a long time, you were trying to be as sensitive as you could in dealing with the death of a young boy that the father was there, in other words.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then at some point you had to ask him some questions about the identification of the voice, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you, as best as you could, even though you knew Mr. Martin was upset and emotional, that you still felt you had a need to ask him at that point, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I think you asked him something to the effect, do you recognize the voice? Or do I have it right, or am I misstating what you said?
It was either do you recognize the voice or is that your son's voice in the background?
Okay. And as this was going on, when you specifically asked him that, I think you described Mr. Martin that his head was down, correct?
It was more like looking away from me and the computer.
Like he didn't even want to deal with it. Is
Yes,
that how
sir.
you interpreted it?
Yes, sir.
And then you stated that it was under his breath, I gather, right? Did I get that right?
Yes, sir.
And you interpreted it as he said no, correct?
Yes, sir.
I mean, you didn't flat out hear the word no unequivocally, or did you hear it like something under his breath and he was distraught?
I heard it and saw the movement of his mouth.
Okay, so you believe, your opinion is that he said no?
Yes, sir, it
Okay.
is.
Now, do you know if that no was directed to the fact that you had just played, literally, not a videotape of his son's death, but an audio tape, or was it related to the identification of the voice? Do you know?
Let me object, Your Honor, that would be speculation of this witness.
Sustained.
Would you agree that when you asked him that, that was after you had played the recording in which you were asking him to identify the voice, but in that same recording, he was hearing for the first time, right, the death of his son,
Yes, sir.
right? As
Yes.
far as you know, he had never heard this shooting before in terms of his son being killed.
Yes, this was prior before it was released, so it had to have been the first time.
Okay. If I may have a moment, Your Honor.
Yes, you may.
And sir, I gather in all your years of doing this, when people are hearing about the death of a loved one, even when you go like to the door, when you go to their house or something, most people, they react like, oh no, like my God, something's happened, their son or loved one is no longer among that. Is that a normal thing that people, or do people just react, oh, okay, no big deal?
It's extreme grief, so yes, that is typical.
And the word no is like, I can't believe it, like he's dead. Isn't that a normal thing?
That would be speculation.
It's based upon what his experience has been, so in that regard, I'll allow it.
Right? It's normal for, when you're telling them about the death of a loved one, people say, no, I can't believe it, that kind of stuff.
It could be construed as denial.
Right?
Yes, sir.
Like, that would be a normal thing based on your experience when people say no, correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. No further questions.
Thank you. Redirect?
Yes, please. When you talked about doing all of the 911 calls, you played all those 911 calls, correct? But
Yes,
it
sir.
was only after, and specifically after you played the Lauer 911 call, that you looked at Mr. Martin and asked if that was the voice of his son screaming in the background, correct?
It was the most graphic, yes, sir.
Right, and it was right at that precise time because you wanted to know what he thought of the voice on the tape, didn't you?
Objection, leading question.
What was the purpose of asking him?
To clarify that it was, in fact, if it was or if it wasn't his son's voice.
Right, because that was significant to your investigation, correct?
Yes, sir. it
You were
was.
doing it, as Mr. Del Leonda said, as sensitively as you could, but it was something you had to do as the chief investigator.
Yes, sir.
Because you knew that if Trayvon Martin's father had said,
Objection is
what
the leading question.
Okay, you need to rephrase your question.
was it significant in your investigation that Mr. Martin said it was not the voice of his son?
It became significant in the investigation because at that point in time, there really wasn't much of a dispute at that time of where that voice came from.
Because it was your understanding in your investigation that other information, well, let me ask you this. What other information supported that was George Zimmerman screaming?
Objection is to hearsay now.
Only to the extent that he was the chief investigating officer, Your Honor, and he,
Okay. No speaking objections,
Sorry.
please. Overruled.
It was statements that I obtained from the initial responding officers, coupled with statements provided by an eyewitness. You want names or?
sure.
Okay, Officer Tim Smith, statements that he had heard the defendant make, and John Good, who at that point had provided me with the statement, both in writing and I believe taped also, that it was his belief that it was George Zimmerman who wanted Young for help.
So, with that information in mind, you were presenting this to Mr. Martin with what idea? What did you want to accomplish by presenting this to Mr. Martin and having him listen to it?
For my own clarification, to make sure that everybody had it correct, or at that point, information that I had was correct.
And did that information, did Mr. Martin's response fit into the other information you already had available?
At that point in time, yes, sir, it did.
And to the extent that he said no, you understood that to be what? When he said no, what question do you think he was answering?
That the voice in the background was not that of his son's.
Did he ever contact you in the days or weeks after that to ask you whether or not he could listen to the tape again?
No, sir, he did not.
Did he ever say anything to you about, I want to change my mind and I want to listen to it again to see anything else about that tape?
No, sir.
Did you question directly Ms. Green in regard to her thought as to whose voice that was?
Not that I recall, sir, no.
Did she counter or contest Tracy Martin's acknowledgement that it was not his son's voice?
Objection calls for hearsay and also an assumption on the part of Ms. Green.
I'll rephrase it.
That the objection sustained.
Did Ms. Green counter, did she say anything that evidenced to you as the investigator that she disagreed with Mr. Martin?
No, sir.
though it was undoubtedly a very emotional time for Mr. Martin and also for you, do you have any concern that he understood your question and that he answered it by saying no?
No, sir.
Thank you. Nothing further.
You were asked about information you had prior to that,
Yes, sir.
and you mentioned Mr. Good, correct? You
Yes, sir.
mentioned Mr. Good and you mentioned the defendant, Mr. Zimmerman, correct?
I didn't mention Mr. Zimmerman. That was independent of Mr. Zimmerman.
Okay, you mentioned Tim Smith,
Yes, sir.
that he had actually heard the call, or he just said, this is what Mr. Zimmerman said?
Yes.
Okay, right?
Yes, based on what Mr. Zimmerman said to Officer Smith.
Right, and you recall when you played that recording to Mr. Zimmerman, that Mr. Zimmerman said, it doesn't sound like me. You recall that?
Yes, I did.
In terms of you played that 911 call and he told you, it doesn't sound like me, correct?
I believe his words were, that doesn't even sound like me, quote unquote.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. And finally, sir, you were asked about Miss Green, who you knew as the fiancee or girlfriend of Mr. Martin, right?
Yes, sir.
And would you agree that she was consoling Mr. Martin, correct?
Yes, sir.
So in terms of what she said, she heard or not, she was focusing on providing whatever comfort she could
Yes,
to
sir.
the father of the father of Trayvon Martin.
Yes, sir.
Would that be accurate?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, I gather in all your experience, you've never had a recording such as this where you don't just have a voice, but you also have the shooting itself all in one recording, or have you had that before?
No, this is the first.
That's the first time?
Yes, sir.
So it was pretty emotionally draining for you two, I'm assuming, having to play that for the victim's dad.
That and the circumstances surrounding the entire incident. Yes, sir.
There's not really a SOP or any kind of written directive in the police logbook or whatever, or case book on how to deal with things like this, is there?
Other than calling for spiritual assistance and support, but at that point in time, that interview or that debriefing or that briefing of the family, there is no that I'm aware of.
And I gather in the reaction of Mr. Martin, you kind of sensed what he was going through too.
Oh, yes, sir.
Was it obvious?
Very much so.
Thank you, sir.
You redirect?
Only on the one issue that was just brought up. When Mr. Zimmerman said to you in the challenge interview that you had with him, doesn't even sound like me, remember that, just brought up by Mr. Del Rionda?
Yes, sir.
You did not take that as an indication that Mr. Zimmerman was denying that it was him on The Voice, did
Objection,
you?
leading question.
Sustained.
Did you, when Mr. Zimmerman said that to you, what indication did that give to you?
As typical as somebody hearing their voice on recording, a lot of people they don't recognize their own voices. It's a little bit different hearing it than how it sounds when you're speaking it.
Within the context of your investigation, did you accept that to be a denial by Mr. Zimmerman that it was actually his voice?
No,
Or
sir.
just that he didn't recognize his own voice?
I didn't take it as a denial, and I took it as him not recognizing his own voice.
Okay. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you. May Officer Serino be excused?
At this time, subject to recall.
Okay, you're excused, but subject to being recalled. Thank you, sir. Call your next witness, please.
Recall Doris Singleton.
Officer Singleton, I'll remind you that you're still under oath. Please come up and have a seat. You may inquire.
Okay, good afternoon, officer. We had left you after you had set the setting for Officer Serino and Mr. Martin and Ms. Green getting ready to listen to the 911 call, the loud 911 call. You remember that testimony?
Yes, I remember.
And again, just tell us about how far away you were from that event.
Closer than I am to his desk right now.
I think you said on earlier testimony about 8 or 10 feet.
I believe it's 8 or 10
Let
feet.
me, if I might approach the witness, I'm going to ask her to stop me at about the distance.
Hey, about right there.
Okay, so you're sitting there, and then
That's-
Officer Sereno's desk would be about here?
That's where they're sitting, yes.
Okay. You weren't actually part of the conversation, though, were you?
No.
You were sort of observing it from afar or from 10 feet away?
Yes, I didn't feel like I should be too close to him. He needed his space.
Okay. But you were listening?
Yes.
And do you recall what it was that you heard Officer Sereno ask Mr. Martin after playing the loud 911 call?
If he recognized the voice.
Okay. Again, do you have the exact words, or you remember?
I don't know if those were exact words, but that was the question, if he had recognized the voice.
Okay, and Mr. Martin's response?
That it was not his son.
I think earlier you said that he actually put his head down or something.
Yes, and he was crying, and he was sad. He had his head down, and he was wiping his face with tissues. His girlfriend was behind him, trying to comfort him. She was kind of rubbing his shoulder some.
Did that, presuming that that was Brandy Green,
I
did
believe
she?
that's who it was.
Okay, did she say anything about whose voice she thought it was on the tape?
I don't recall hearing her say anything.
Tracy Martin saying that was not his voice, that it's not his son's voice?
Yes.
Okay. And you clearly heard him say those words?
I don't know his exact words, but he was telling us that it was not his, or he was telling Chris that it was not his son's voice that was screaming for help.
I mean, he said words, in other words, like you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. And then after that, he put his head down, is what you're saying?
I think it was even while listening to it
Okay.
that he was already crying, because you could hear the gunshot.
And so, obviously, you were sensitive of that too, the fact that they were playing this recording to the father of the person that's being shot on the tape, correct?
Yes, I was choked up myself. I had to stand back, and I felt, I could feel how he must feel, because I have children, and I was choked up by it, and I felt horrible for him.
And you could see that and sense that in Mr. Martin?
Yes.
Okay. And now, were you there for the playing of all the recordings, or just part of it?
I don't know if there was more recordings. That really stuck out in my mind, because I remember feeling so awful for him, that he would have to hear that.
So as far as you can recall, the only one you recall is the one where they were playing the recording of the screams, but also the shooting of
Yes.
Mr. Martin's son.
Yes, and that's why it stood out in my mind.
And what stood on your mind is the pain that that father must have been going through at the time.
Yes, to know that he was hearing the sound that ended his son's life was tough to watch.
And did he, in your opinion, react as any grieving father would react?
Yes, he was very sad.
Now, he didn't get up and start screaming or anything, correct? He just basically put his head down and just started crying, right?
He was, I could see him wiping tears from his eyes. And, I mean, he didn't lose it. I'm sure he was trying to hold himself together, and he's in the middle of the police department. But you could see that he was upset, of course.
And as you indicated, even while you were doing it, even from a distance away, it was hard for you to listen to that, correct?
Yes, and I had already heard it.
And I think you've already stated you felt awful for him, correct?
I can't imagine having to go through that, because I have children, and I couldn't imagine.
Thank you, ma'am.
Redirect.
Briefly, as sad as it was, both for you to listen to and obviously for Mr. Martin to go through, Is there any doubt in your mind that he had said that that was not his son's voice that he heard screaming?
No, there's no doubt that he was telling us that that didn't sound like his son to him.
Thank you. Nothing further.
May Officer Singleton be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Subject to recall.
You're excused, subject to being recalled? Today? No. We'll call you. Thank you. Call your next witness, please.
Defense would call Adam Pollock.
Yes, you may.
You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
You may proceed.
Good afternoon, sir. State your name, please,
Adam Pollock.
and your occupation.
I own a gym and I'm a trainer.
Okay, tell me how long you've been involved in, when you say owning a gym, how long have you owned a gym?
I've owned my gym right now for over 14 years.
And what's the name of it?
Cocapelli's Gym?
Here in Seminole County?
Yes.
And let's talk a bit about your background, how you got into owning a gym. So maybe we'll go backwards in time. You've owned that
Sure.
gym for about 14 years?
Mm-hmm.
And how about, you'll need to say either yes
Yes.
or no, just so the court reporter, I can understand it, but we need to get on record. So let's go back before you owned the gym. Were you involved in training or like activities?
Absolutely.
And tell me, if you would, what your first experience was in this area that you've taken on as your career.
I started in the gyms at about 4 years old, and I've been in the gyms my entire life. I started as a competitive athlete and worked into a trainer, and that eventually led into being a gym owner, and it's kind of worked its way. That's what I do now.
Okay, when you say competitive athlete, tell us a bit more about what that means.
I started off as a child playing a variety of competitive sports, including soccer, basketball, racquetball. I actually toured for a while as a pro in racquetball, fighting for boxing and Muay Thai.
Tell me, let's focus then on the experience you've had in fighting, and tell me about that.
I've been involved in fight training for a majority of my life. I started competing regularly after about 18, and I did that for quite a few years.
What type of competing are you speaking of?
For Muay Thai work.
And explain, if you would, to the
Kickboxing.
jury what that is for those of us who don't know.
Very much like boxing, but it's another ring sport like boxing. But with Muay Thai, you're allowed to punch, kick, knee, elbow, clinch. You can hold and hit.
Is that, I guess, closer to what we might call kickboxing?
Yes,
And you competed in that
correct.
for how many years?
I don't know exactly, quite a few.
Okay. During that time, what other training did you do, or how else did you involve yourself in this industry?
I've been around weight training my whole life. My brother's a former Mr. USA and a nationally ranked bodybuilder and powerlifter. So I just grew up in the gym. So I have a fairly extensive background, as far as the weight training, and I also have a background with competitive kettlebell lifting.
Okay. have you ever assisted in other activities around the ring or for other fighters who are in the ring?
Absolutely.
What would that include?
I've worked corners for many, both amateur and professional fighters for all different levels of competition.
What does working the corner mean?
When you take the fighter to compete, somebody has to take care of the athlete. So when they come back to the corner between rounds, well, actually preparing them to go out to compete, and then when they come back to the corner between rounds, you have to go and make sure to give them water, any type of cuts, bruising, icing, etc. You have to address accordingly, in a very short period of time, and then send them back out to do the next round.
If I asked you to guesstimate how many times you were a corner man,
Too many to count.
okay? And this is again during the same time that you've been involved in this industry, both doing Muay Thai training and competing and other fighting?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this has been consistent over the last 20 plus years.
If I was to say the term MMA to you, what would you interpret that to mean?
Mixed martial arts, which is a competitive fighting sport that has gotten extremely popular recently.
And is that the stuff that we see if we watch such things on TV, where you see sort of almost a mix of kickboxing, regular boxing, and whatever else you can do?
Yes, in mixed martial arts, it's basically you can do almost an amalgamation of boxing, kickboxing, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, submission grappling, to where you can punch, kick, etc. And then when you get onto the ground, you can work submission holds, chokes, arm locks, leg locks, things of that nature.
Okay. And so within the context of MMA, there are a lot of different disciplines, or are there many different disciplines that can be folded into MMA?
Absolutely.
Some of them would be traditional boxing and, as you said, wrestling.
Correct.
And then some of the more unique ones like Muay Thai.
Absolutely. The beauty of a mixed sport is that you can have different attributes where somebody can be extremely good at one attribute and not very good at another and still be able to do well in a mixed type of environment.
And the MMA, by definition, allows for many different disciplines and your strengths and weaknesses in those different disciplines to come to the forefront in the ring, right?
Correct.
Are there, within that context of MMA, are there particular moves or holds that are sort of identified or universal?
Yes.
Okay. I'm sure there's probably 1,000.
Well,
I'm going to focus you
quite
on,
a few.
Okay. I'm going to focus you on one until you can explain that. Do you know what the term ground and pound means?
Yes.
Have you ever used that maneuver before I have you explain it?
As far as have I had to use it personally?
I guess, yeah.
Well, I didn't when I was actively competing, I didn't compete in mixed martial arts myself.
Gotcha.
I have trained quite a few others and who have competed in mixed martial arts at extremely high levels.
Okay. What is a ground and pound?
Basically, for a ground and pound, what you're going to be doing is taking an opponent, putting them on the ground, controlling them, so you're going to be mounted on top of them.
Let's take that a little bit slow. When you say get an opponent on the ground, I'm presuming that they're just not going to say yes if you ask them. So what do you mean?
Absolutely not.
So how do you, in a fight situation, how do you get the opponent on the ground?
Well, you're going to have some means of taking them to the ground, where first you get them on the ground. Once you get them on the ground, then you're going to go and keep them on the ground. And then while you're keeping them on the ground, then you'll go and start striking them from the top downwards.
In mixed martial arts, is there an art to the idea of getting in the first punch or the first blow to take control of a match?
Absolutely.
And tell the jury about that.
As far as the art to
Well,
to
how do
doing
you
that?
do it? What do you do, and why do you do it?
Well, obviously, the reason you're going to do that is to control what's going on with your opponent. So if you're effective with the first blow, that can potentially end the fight immediately.
In mixed martial arts matches, are there referees?
Absolutely.
Are there times? Do they last a certain?
Absolutely.
And how does a fight begin in mixed martial arts?
They begin standing up, where you'll have, nowadays you have a cage, it's very popular, with the UFC is the octagon. And you'll have opponents on either side, and then referee will stand in the middle, the bell will sound, and then they'll come out and they'll fight.
So there's a bell that documents that the round has begun?
Correct.
Is that such that both opponents would know that?
Correct.
Okay, so now let's talk about the attempt to gain the upper hand, I guess you said, in the first blow or the first punch. I may have interrupted you, or you were explaining that.
Well, rephrase the question, please.
Okay. What is the benefit of trying to get in the first blow or the first punch on your opponent?
Well, if you're effective with it, that's going to go and put you into a much stronger position over your opponent.
On occasion, do those first blows put you in a position where you can get the opponent on the ground?
On occasion, those first blows end a fight.
I was talking again about ground and pound. Once you get the opponent on the floor, you said you mount them. Explain to the jury what you mean by that.
Okay, in positioning, if you have an individual ends up on the bottom, well, if you end up on the ground, you're going to end up in one of two positions, either on the top or on the bottom. If you end up in the bottom, you'll have somebody above you, and depending on what position they're in, they'll be either more or less advantageous for the next movement they're going to have to make. A mounted position would be something where if a person is lying, say, flat on their back, the person above them would have their legs above the other person's hips. So sitting across the waist, chest, as opposed to what's considered the guard position, where the person on the top would be between the individual's legs.
Okay. At the risk of personal injury, I'm going to ask the court to allow you to step down from the stand to give me an example of a mounted position.
Okay.
How do you stop an MMA fight if you need to?
How do you stop an MMA?
Yes.
Well, the way you stop an MMA fight, if you're the one who's losing, is you can tap. You can say, I quit. You can turn away where you face the other direction.
Keep all of that in mind as we go through this, okay? Tell me where you want me as far as I want you to show the jury what a mounted position is as you being on top and me being on the bottom.
Okay, so we'll have you just simply lay down. We'll have you on your back. And it might be helpful for them if you're sideways. Okay. So that's fine. So a mounted position, I would be in a position much like this.
And you said a moment ago that your legs are outside of my hips, correct?
Right, as opposed to a guard position where I would be between his legs, which would be much more of this nature, where here he's going to be able to use his hands and his legs and his arms to defend. Here he's not going to have the same ability to use the hands and legs to defend. Here he'd only be able to use his hands, and he'd be impaired somewhat because I'm going to have both my hands and legs available.
Now, if you go to the mounted position again for a moment and tell me why that is a more powerful position.
Well, here I've got a scenario where there's a lot more that I can do to him than what he can do to me. Where you can see in the other scenario, there's more he can do to defend, to escape, to get out of that position.
And while I'm here, how can a person on the bottom attempt to get out from a situation like this?
There's a number of different things a person can do. One of them would be to attempt to pull the person down to bridge and roll over. Another one would be to attempt to escape your hips, which is similar to what's called shrimping.
Sorry, called what?
Shrimping. Or basically you get on your side, push one of my knees down, try to get your hips out, to get your leg around, to put me back into a position where I would be in what's called the guard.
Okay, tap.
And tapping, and you get it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yep.
Sir.
Return back.
Take your seat.
Thanks, sir.
Why, just so we're clear, is the mounted position a powerful position when you're in a fight?
Well, first and foremost, you're on the top. And when you're on the top, you have gravity working for you. So if you strike downward, it's going to be extremely effective comparatively to trying to punch up in the air.
With the concept that you mentioned a moment ago of what I could do on the bottom of shrimping, is that a way of, in layman's vernacular, just sort of trying to move myself away and throw you off balance?
Correct.
and if I can, in doing that, can I then get your legs up at least momentarily, or get you off balance?
Oh, yes, absolutely, if you do it well.
Is there a benefit to me trying to simply push myself back this way, away from you, in effect bringing your legs from over my hips to at them or even under them?
Absolutely.
And tell me about that.
Well, if the person who's on the bottom can get into a position from, instead of being mounted, into it's called the guard position, then instead of just having the hands to attempt to defend, they can have the hands and legs to help to defend.
And that would also expose the hips, correct, if you would be able to accomplish that?
What do you mean by expose the hips?
You would get the person on top mounted, you would have them further down your legs and not on top of your hips?
Correct.
Because when on top of the hips, what can the person on the bottom do?
Same, they're still mounted. If the person is on the hips or above, it's still mounted. You're not out of the mounted position until the person's actually between your legs.
And then when in a mounted position, then is that where a ground and pound can occur?
Correct.
Is that part of it?
Correct.
So then explain exactly what a ground and pound is.
Well, if you've got somebody who's controlled and they're kind of stuck, they're to a certain extent quasi-helpless. I mean, there are things that can be done from the bottom, but it's going to require a bit more skill versus someone who doesn't have the skill. Generally, if somebody has the skill to put somebody else on the bottom, they usually have the skill to keep them there. Not always, especially with, accomplished athletes.
At that point, you're talking about equally trained fighters, correct?
Correct.
One who knows enough on how to get somebody in a mounted position and the other one knowing, because they're in the ring, how to maybe get out of it.
Correct.
Let's talk a bit more now about Mr. Zimmerman. You know him, do you not?
Absolutely.
And do you
I
recall
do.
when you first met him?
Yes.
About when was that?
That would have been, I want to say, roughly October of 2010.
Okay. And he came to your gym?
Correct.
And what did he come to your gym for?
He came to the gym to lose weight and to get into shape.
And did you assist him in that regard?
Absolutely.
How so?
I put him on a program where we trained him and we gave him a diet to help him to lose weight and get into shape.
Okay. And can you tell the jury then the regimen that you initially came up with for him, both diet and exercise?
Sure.
And how that was accomplished?
We started off, as far as his exercise regime, we started him off with grappling based upon his work and school schedule because of availability. And when we offered the particular classes, we have different classes at different hours of the day, and those particular classes worked for his schedule.
So did he pick his classes then based upon his school and work schedule?
Yes.
It wasn't because he wanted to learn one particular form or idea over the other?
No, I believe when he first came to me, I actually wanted to learn how to box, but the scheduling wasn't available for that, so he chose grappling instead, because that was available.
If you would explain to the jury, we may have a little bit here, but explain to the jury what grappling, how you define it, what that is.
How I define grappling?
Yes.
In layman's terms?
Yes.
Think of it much like wrestling, only with wrestling the purpose is to pin the person on the ground. With submission grappling, the goal is for submissions, chokes, arm locks, leg locks, basically make the person say uncle, if you will.
Okay. And any particular moves that you learn within grappling to accomplish that?
Absolutely.
And can you give us some? And describe them a bit so that they're not just words.
There's going to be positioning moves to learn how to control your opponent and how to avoid being controlled. Things like shrimping, bridging, side control, how to go and control your base so that you're able to go and move your hips appropriately. And then, of course, you're going to get into, submissions, chokes, arm locks, leg locks, things of that nature.
Did you said that Mr. Zimmerman involved himself in grappling?
Correct.
Do you recall about how long that training was, how many hours per week or month?
Well, we had the grappling classes were only offered 4 days a week, and for the most part, I think he may have trained 2 to 3 days a week at the most.
Okay. And how long were those classes?
How long is a normal training session?
Yes.
Normal training sessions are 2 hours long.
Okay. And did you sort of supervise seeing how he was doing in the grappling?
Well, I supervise all of it.
Okay. then tell the jury, if you would, just how accomplished he was at grappling.
He wasn't. He was a ranked beginner.
And what do you mean by that?
Well, there's a difference between an accomplished athlete and somebody who's there who's just not physically an accomplished individual. You know, I mean, look, if you look at a professional athlete in any sport, you know, it's really easy to say, well, this guy's just done, you know, a certain amount of work, but there's also a certain amount of predisposition that they have of athleticism, strength, that kind of feeds for that, and then the more they train, the better they get and the stronger they get and the faster they get and things of that nature. So it's, let's say we figured a scale of 1 to 10. If you start off on a scale of 1, you're going to do a lot more work to get to 10. If you start off on a scale of 5, because you've done a bunch of work previously, there's less work it's going to take to get you to 10 comparatively.
Okay.
Usually when you see an accomplished athlete, you know, when they come into a gym, they've already had a history as a child of all kinds of athletics that they've been exposed to. And if you have an adult that hasn't had that type of background exposure, they're going to have a bit more work, and they're probably never going to get to the same degree of accomplishment that somebody who had that childhood background has had.
Along that scale of 1 to 10, when George Zimmerman first got to you, what number would you assign to his abilities?
0.5.
Less than a 1.
Yes.
After, I'm going to sort of fast forward, as a grappler, having been through, well, let me ask this. Tell us about the length of time where Mr. Zimmerman was involved with your gym.
George actually trained, once I looked up the information, it was just under a year, or actually about a year that he was actually, you know, part of the gym as far as training goes.
Okay.
And of that, he had some time that he had put his membership on hold because of his schedule and whatnot.
Okay. For future purposes, and to keep the record clear, I know that you may call him by his first name, but we're going to use first and last name.
Yes, sir.
George Zimmerman, if you would, just so we keep it very clear.
Yes, sir.
He was there for about a year minus a few months of hiatus, did you say?
Yes.
During that time, then, I understand that he did some grappling, correct? And he did some other type of training?
Boxing training.
Okay. Anything else?
He would occasionally come in to use the facility on his own.
So let's talk about boxing. He came to you, I think you said a 0.5?
Correct.
And when do you remember when he left, approximately?
When he left?
When he stopped coming to the gym?
Well, after the incident.
Okay. In the months prior to the incident, presumably that happened in February of 2012, was he coming then, or was that when he was on hiatus?
That's when he was on hiatus.
So going back in time, do you know about the last time he was at the gym?
I don't have an exact date because I don't keep those records necessarily. He had asked me, I want to say, to put his account on hold for November, December, and he might have just started coming back in, January-ish.
Of 2012, meaning that his account was on
Correct.
hiatus in 2011, November?
The end of 2011.
So during that approximate year, give or take a few months that he was involved with your facility in grappling, he got from a 0.5 to what rating would you give him on your scale?
Maybe a 1?
And why
Maybe
so little
1.5?
progress?
Well, it's not that he made such little progress, it's a tremendous amount of work. It's really easy to get the concept that somebody joins up to Gold's Gym and then are automatically a professional bodybuilder, or if somebody joins up to a fight gym, they're a world champion fighter. It just doesn't work that way. It's a tremendous amount of work. It takes a lot of dedication, a lot of athleticism.
And did he simply not put that level of work into it?
No, he was very diligent, very coachable, very pleasant to work with. There's just a certain strength level and athleticism, and it takes a tremendous amount of time to develop that. And he didn't have that history and background of childhood athletics that helps to create that.
So on a similar scale, if you would, not in the grappling environment, but just in general athleticism, I think you've identified that you have a feel for where people fit in their abilities based upon their history and athleticism.
Mm-hmm.
On a scale of 1 to 10, where would Mr. Zimmerman fit?
Like I said, about a 1.
Generally in his overall athleticism as well?
Well, as far as what I'm looking at in the gym, yes.
Mm-hmm. let's talk then about his proficiency in the boxing that he took. First of all, tell us what it is, what you do when you start out, and what you progress to as you learn more about boxing.
Okay. The way we first start in my facility is we start just simply getting proficient within your own body. So if you don't have control of your body, it's going to make sure, it's not going to really facilitate other things working well. So if I started somebody in the boxing ring sparring right off the bat before they know how to punch or defend or move, that's going to produce a pretty unpleasant result. So instead of creating that type of situation where it's a liability and people are just getting damaged, we'll start off learning how to control their body. Calisthenics, footwork, ab work, just learning structural integrity and aligning their frame.
Okay.
At the beginning.
And tell me then how Mrs. Zimmerman came to you in the beginning, again on a sort of scale of 1 to 10 as far as his boxing proficiency.
Like 0.5.
Okay. And what did he do then along the way to progress?
He basically just took the normal classes that we offered, and he was diligent about training and working hard. I mean, he was a hard worker, but even a hard worker, without having some of that background, it's still going to take a certain amount of time of development. I've had guys that start off with tremendous levels of athleticism, and they can get themselves to a fighting level generally within about a year, sometimes 2, to actually be a skilled competitor. Because I don't throw people in the ring. There are some gyms that they'll throw somebody in the ring. They've been there for a couple of weeks. They'll just throw them in there. If the person gets hurt, well, too bad for that person. I don't do that. So if somebody's not skilled, they don't get in the ring. That's all there is to it.
Did Mrs. Zimmerman ever get in the ring?
No,
Why not?
because he wasn't skilled enough for that. Mr. Zimmerman, worked diligently at learning how to control his body better than what he had. And, the steps that we'll start off with all those calisthenics, then we'll put a person on the heavy bag where they'll start to learn how to throw a punch with shadow boxing and heavy bag work. And once they get proficient with that, then we'll start pairing them up with a partner for doing defensive counters where somebody would throw a punch at them and they learn how to go and defend the punch, catching, parrying, redirecting, leverage stopping, etc. And then once they got proficient with that, then we'll start learning how to move with slipping and weaving and shuffling and putting some real movement to it.
And what point did George Zimmerman get to in that training sort of progression?
He never got off shadow boxing and hitting the heavy bag and learning how to punch.
So tell me or explain to the jury what that means.
He's still learning how to punch. He didn't know how to really effectively punch.
And what is hitting the heavy bag?
You have a heavy bag, you stand in front of it, you get your hands wrapped up, you put on some bag gloves, and you punch the bag. And learning how to have proper biomechanics to use your frame appropriately so you're not going to deliver some power to the target without hurting your hands or elbows or shoulders or things of that nature.
Did he ever progress to the point where he could box somebody else?
Absolutely not.
And why, you may have just answered this, I apologize, but why would you not let him get to that point, or why did he not get to that point?
It's not a matter of me not letting him get to that point. It's a matter of him simply being physically accomplished to do that. If somebody's not physically accomplished to do that, I'm not going to put them in harm's way.
Did he ever do any, and I think your answer was the same, what was his progression then from the .05? What did he progress to as a boxer?
Well, he never got off of learning how to punch, so not very far. I mean, he improved his physicalness considerably, where he lost a lot of weight because of the diet and the exercise, but regardless of body weight, there's a matter of athleticism, and you can lose all kinds of weight and still not have the athleticism to be ready to climb into the boxing ring with an opponent.
When he came to your gym, was he grossly obese?
Absolutely.
And was that a main focus of his workout regimen?
That was the main focus of why he was there, is to lose weight and to get into better shape.
And was he, in fact, at least accomplishing that?
Absolutely. And he was doing very well with that.
And could you tell what part of that, to the extent that you were aware of it, what part of that was dietary changes and what part of that was the exercise program?
It's both.
Did he try any other, I'm going to call them disciplines? You had mentioned, I think you had mentioned Muay Thai. or anything like that? Did he ever endeavor into any of that?
Well, with Muay Thai in my facility, if you can't box, you're not going to learn how to kickbox. You're going to have to learn how to punch before we're going to learn how to kick. So they would go step by step once again. So he never got to a point to where I would start him on learning how to kick because he still didn't have a handle on punching.
Any other progressions in his training while he was at your gym that we've not talked about?
I'm not sure I understand.
Anything else that we've talked about him, a little bit of grappling and boxing, and you gave us, I think, your indication as to how much he had progressed. I'm just curious if there's anything else that I've not asked you about as far as what he learned there or what he progressed in.
No, that's what he was working off of. You know, those were the forms of exercise that he was engaging with. He did do a little bit of, you know, weight training on his own because we've got a facility where it's available for that, but that was not a consistent, frequent thing.
And in your corner work, I presume that you've seen people getting injured in fights, correct?
Absolutely.
Almost every time?
No, depending on the skill set of the athlete that's out there. I've had athletes get out there to fight and never even get hit and knock their opponent right out. I've had other guys that come back to the corner and that eye is swelled completely shut.
You had an opportunity to see Mr. Zimmerman shortly after the altercation with Mr. Martin, correct?
Yes.
Can you tell the jury when that was?
I don't know the exact date, but I would say it was within a couple of days after the incident.
And describe him, if you would, if you noticed what he looked like.
He had black eyes, his nose was scraped up, he had some bandages on his head, and that as far as the obvious, you know, physical bruising that he had. He looked emotionally traumatized.
Have you seen that in fighters that you've worked with?
I've seen that in people, and generally not in fighters after, you know, after they've been competing for a while. A little bit different. He had the look of a human being who had been through an extremely traumatic experience and was traumatized from it. Almost like a state of shock that was continuing.
Did he have a conversation with you where he discussed shrimping in regards to this event?
Yes, he did.
What was that?
When he came...
Please approach. Objection sustained.
As far as you had testified regarding his athleticism, what words within that context, how would you define George Zimmerman?
Non-athletic. I think probably the best way of describing it, I had happened to have had a meeting with one of my other trainers that I saw, happened to be yesterday. Had a very brief conversation with him, and when I first mentioned what I was going to be coming to testify, you know, he didn't realize that this was the same person that we were referring to.
Sustained.
Not,
Let me...
hold on one second. I was asking you for you to describe Mrs. Zimmerman, and I think you were going to give us a story about maybe how somebody else described him? That's been objected to and sustained, which means you can't tell us what the other person said?
Yep.
But if you can tell us in your words.
He was, and I really don't like to use this type of terminology.
We've heard words that we
I'm
normally
sure.
don't use. So.
Soft. He's just physically soft. You know, he's not a, you know, he was a overweight, large man when he came to us, and a very, very pleasant, very nice man, but physically soft. He was predominantly fat, not a lot of muscle, and not a lot of strength.
A moment, Your Honor. Within the context of at least organized fighting, you had mentioned a couple of different ways to end a fight, be tapping out.
Yes, sir.
Does screaming for help work?
If you're in a competitive situation, you can, you know, you can verbally tap out by saying, "I quit," and then the referee will step in and assist.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you, Your Honor. Afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
I'm going to let you plug your gym for a minute. Would you tell us what your slogan is?
I'm sorry?
Tell me the slogan of your gym, if you would.
The slogan of our gym is "Learn without getting hit."
You ever call it the anything about being the most complete fight gym in the world?
Well, some time ago, we've got a rather large facility, and so some time ago, you know, we'd set up on our website, because there was really no facilities around that had full weight training facilities and full fight training facilities. So we put it as the most complete fight gym in the world. At that point, that was accurate. You know, things have changed. Now there's a lot of gyms that have followed suit to what I do, and they've updated their facilities now to have, you know, weights and whatnot as well.
Speaking of other gyms, I understand that Mr. Zimmerman was going to yours for, I guess, somewhere, I think you said between October of 2010 and the end of 2011. Then he took a couple months off and then came back?
Basically.
Okay. Do you know, if at all, he might have been going anyplace else, whether that was another gym that you like you mentioned, or just working out at home, or working out at, for example, some apartment complexes or communities have fitness centers, that sort of thing? Any idea whether he was doing any of that?
Not to my knowledge. You know, we've got a very unusually complete facility, and it makes it really easy, and we kind of give a lot of leeway of access to the facility for the members. So he's got access to a place that would be unlike any place else that would be available to him. So it wouldn't make a lot of sense for him to be going somewhere else, you know, and he was a very loyal type of individual, so I don't foresee him going some other facility.
Would you have encouraged him to work out sort of on his own? I mean, something as simple as going for a run on his own, or lifting some weights at home, or anything like that.
If generally, I encourage my students to come to as many training sessions as possible so they can have supervised instruction so that they're not creating bad habits.
Would you tell him not to work out alone?
I would tell them to come in for more training sessions at our facility.
The weight that the defendant lost was in the ballpark of 90 pounds or better, right?
I don't have an exact measurement, but when he first started, he was in, I want to say, between 250 and 260 pounds, and he would have lost, you know, between 50 to 80 pounds.
Okay. And actually, I think you testified before that his body mass index was somewhere between 15 and 20% body fat.
I don't have the exact amount because I didn't do a body fat analysis on him, but I would think that he probably had a little bit more body fat than that.
Okay. Do you remember talking about somewhere between 16 and 20%?
I remember hearing and looking at a deposition on that, and I saw the numbers on there. And when I saw the numbers on there, it seemed a little odd to me because it seemed a little bit low for him.
You certainly don't deny that that's what you said, right?
I'm not arguing whether I said that or not.
Okay. As far as, I guess let's talk about the first blow advantage type of thing first, right? The first
Sure.
blow can be a very good advantage in a combat situation.
Correct.
And you would have taught, I guess, all of your students this fact.
Well, I'm not going to start teaching somebody about strategy if they don't have a base of fundamentals.
Would they have absorbed this or seen this or heard it talked about? Any chance of that?
I mean, is there a chance of that? Sure, you can turn on the TV and figure some things out, but that's not something that I'm going to teach a beginner as far as strategy goes if they don't have the basis of fundamentals.
It's not a big advantage, though, if you don't execute it properly or well.
Well, it's not going to do anything for you if you don't do anything with it,
Could put you actually in a worse position.
potentially.
Talked about some techniques, bridging and shrimping and that sort of thing. Those are designed actually to move you from a unfavorable position to a less unfavorable position.
Correct.
And they're designed to effect that change of position as quickly as you can do it.
Correct.
Because when you're grappling, that's actually a fairly physically exhausting situation.
Absolutely.
And is that why they fight in, I guess, some, we could call them short rounds, but obviously you've been a professional, you know that sometimes even a 3-minute round can seem like forever.
Force it.
Okay. And you said you also taught submission, arm locks, and that sorts of things, right?
Correct.
Those are also designed to be applied in a grappling scenario, even perhaps if you're not able to do much of anything else. In other words, when you can't strike, sometimes you could use a different type of hold.
I'm not sure I understand what you're going at with this.
Okay. If you can't, you mentioned that a person on the bottom sometimes, it's going to be hard to strike upward.
Correct.
Could you grab a hold of, for example, an arm and apply one of the grappling holds in lieu of actually being able to punch?
Potentially, yes, depending on the position that you're in. If you're in a mounted position, grabbing someone's arm to attempt to submit them from simply grabbing their arm is not a particularly practical thing. It's not going to work.
It wouldn't work well, but that would be a grappling maneuver, the arm lock.
Well, the arm lock is not going to be applied if you're on your back being mounted. You can't arm lock somebody from that position.
So it wouldn't even be possible to do.
Well, you have to be extremely skilled, and you'd have to have, there's a couple of obscure angles that could be implemented from, but you'd have to be extremely skilled to do it.
Would you say that someone like the defendant had the skill to be able to do that?
Absolutely not. Not
No
even
way.
close. No way. No way.
And if he said he did it, you wouldn't believe it?
No. Absolutely not. As far as submitting somebody with an arm bar from while he's being mounted, no.
Okay. Let's talk about striking for a little while if we could, the punching. And I know that the Muay Thai, you get into the kicking and the knees and the elbows. Punching, you would teach a number of different strikes, right? The jab, the cross, the hook,
Uppercuts.
all of those?
Yep.
And you said you had him working with a heavy bag. Would you ever do the sparring mitts with someone where you...
If they don't know how to control their body to throw a punch properly without hurting their wrists or their elbows on a heavy bag in shadow boxing, putting them on focus mitts is, I'm not going to do that with them.
Is that a no? You never put him on mitts?
No.
What weight were his gloves?
He had bag gloves, which were going to be light, as opposed to like a 16-ounce boxing glove or sparring glove. Generally, an old school bag glove is probably 4 to 6 ounces.
Okay. And you'd have him wrist wrapped and everything like that?
Correct.
So to help avoid hurting himself when he punched?
Correct.
Because the idea is you punch hard enough that you should hurt the thing you're striking.
Well, if you don't have good support in your hands and you hit hard, you can hurt your hands and your wrists.
And when you would have him do these workouts for, I think you said like the first hour was the calisthenics and the cardio and that sort of thing, and then the second hour would be the skill development portion?
Correct.
So for this hour that he's working on his punching technique, he would be using all of those punches.
What do you mean all those punches?
Would you be having him work on just jabs, or would you be having him work on...
At the beginning, he's going to work on just footwork, and then structural integrity and how to learn how to hold and posture his body, and then learn how to throw a jab. And once he starts to get proficiency with the jab, then we'll start bringing in a straight right hand, and then we'll start bringing in a hook. And once he starts to get proficient with those to where he's not hurting himself and he can work, then we'll start putting combinations of those punches together.
And just like with grappling, sitting in there trying to throw nothing but punches for an entire minute, that can get pretty exhausting pretty quick too.
Without question.
You mentioned teaching positioning of hands and positioning of feet. The hands, you would teach the hands up guarded position, right? When you're teaching punching.
As opposed to the hands down guarded position?
Let me put that better. You're supposed to guard your face so that you can peek over and see your target, but not, that if you do get hit, what you get hit with bumped by is your own gloves, right?
More or less.
Okay. would you teach the proper position to hold your hands?
Correct.
And I think you said that you offered the classes about 4 times a week, and he went, best you can tell, 2 or 3 times a week.
That was the grappling classes. We have for more of the boxing classes and striking classes, we have more classes available
Okay.
and at different hours.
So 2 or 3 times just for grappling.
Mm-hmm.
Is that yes?
Correct.
Okay.
Now, he did not do grappling and striking training sessions simultaneously. He did one or the other.
All right. So if he did 2 grappling sessions a week, then we might have 1 striking session?
No.
No?
No, he did a number of months where he did just the grappling sessions,
Okay.
and then his school schedule or work schedule, whatever it was, changed. And so he came to me and asked, well, what can we do because my schedule changed? And the time slots worked for him to be able to go into the boxing classes.
Interspersed with those would be what you referenced, the occasional weightlifting and the other sessions that he would do.
What other sessions?
You mentioned that he would sometimes come in to work out and weightlifting and things on his
Right,
own. Okay.
right.
So we're talking.
But that was not a very regular thing. You know, I mean, probably a dozen times over the course of the year that I, recall seeing him come in to go and
Once or twice a month.
something like that, yeah.
Okay. So we're talking somewhere between, sounds like 6 to 10 hours a week, depending on what week it was.
I think, no, 6 to 10 hours a week is a little bit more than he did.
Okay. Aren't the sessions 2 hours apiece?
2 hours long, and if he trained 3 times a week, that would have been 6 hours.
Okay.
So it wouldn't have been any more than 6 hours a week. That would have been a max.
All right.
And there were certain weeks that he had things come up that he didn't show up at all.
And when a person works out at your gym, I guess y'all take care, try to make sure people don't hurt themselves.
Correct,
That they don't get in situations they can't handle.
correct,
And you would never want them to put themselves in a situation that they weren't ready to handle.
correct.
Let me just ask you, occasionally that would happen anyway?
I'm sorry?
Would that occasionally happen anyway, not under your supervision, but you've said that you've seen people try and get in the ring and fight and do things that they're just not ready to do?
Oh, I've seen that not in my facility. I've seen that in other gyms before.
People think they can do it and they're not ready to do it?
Absolutely,
Okay. Doesn't stop them from trying, it just stops them from having a good outcome?
correct.
Okay. Anything else? Thank you. Another question, Judge?
Thank you. Any redirect?
Very briefly, Your Honor. So as to when we talk about the progression, his proficiency in boxing, jabbing, and then other things, hooks and whatnot, had he gotten at any level of proficiency where you could work with him on other strikes, or was it just still punching the bag?
Just punching the bag and shadow boxing. And the actuality, he'd really predominantly just worked on throwing the jab in the right hand and just, barely starting to learn how to throw a hook.
Okay. So he had not yet gotten proficient in the jab. Would that be
He
accurate?
had not gotten proficient, truly proficient with all of it.
Or with any of it?
No, no. I mean, he was doing pretty good within his own scope with the stretches and exercises, and he was a hard worker, but he was not an accomplished athlete in any way, shape, or form.
Okay. When Mr. Manti asked you about arm locks and things like that, you were talking about somebody who's fairly proficient in it, correct?
They'd have to be from the positions he was discussing.
Did you train Mrs. Zimmerman at all in anything having to do with arm locks or things like that?
He wasn't accomplished enough for that.
Okay, so he had not gotten any experience in arm locking or something?
Well, he'd been around in a class when we were covering things of that nature as far as chokes and arm locks, but that was not something that he could pull off.
But even if I never came to your gym, if you jumped on top of me, I might grab your arm and try and take it away, right?
Absolutely.
That would not be what you would define as an arm lock, would it?
Not even close.
There would just be a grabbing of a hand?
It's a reflex. Understand, what we do is we try to go and train a skill set to where you're having conditioned reflexes. That takes quite a bit of work.
Okay. You had said you defined Mr. Zimmerman as soft sort of in the beginning of all of this.
Mm-hmm.
How was he when he left your gym? How would you define him?
Well, he had lost quite a bit of weight, so he was in physically better shape as far as the amount of fat he was carrying comparatively, but he still had a long way to go. He wasn't, shredded and ripped like a, competitive fighter or a bodybuilder or anything of that nature. He still had more body fat to lose. He still could have had to use to go and gain a bit of muscle. He was greatly improved from the way he'd first started, but he was by no means ready for being a competitive athlete by any stretch,
As far
or
as
even
his-
dealing with any type of competitive athlete.
As far as his athleticism, at the end, when you last saw him in the gym, would you still consider him soft?
Absolutely.
Nothing further than you want to thank you.
Thank you. May Mr. Pollock be excused?
Yes, Your
Thank you very much for your
Thank you.
excuse. Call your next witness, please.
Honor. Any chance this might be a decent time for a break? I can organize witnesses a little bit.
Sure, we'll take a 15-minute recess. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your notepads face down on the chair and follow Deputy Jarvis back into the jury room. Seated, court will be in recess for 15 minutes. please be seated. Council, please approach for a moment. me know when you're ready to bring the, let me know when you're ready to bring the jury back in.
We're ready for the jury.
Okay, thank you. State ready?
Yes, Your Honor.
Please bring the jury back in.
Jurors present, rise.
Please be seated. Mr. O'Mara, call your next witness, please.
Defense will call Tracy Martin, Your Honor.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
You may proceed.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
State your name, please.
Tracy Benjamin Martin.
And, of course, you're Trayvon Martin's father.
Yes,
You've been here for the testimony throughout the trial, correct?
correct.
Including today when we had a couple of officers testifying about an event where you had gone to meet with investigator Chris Serino at Sanford Police Department.
Correct.
Remember that?
Yes,
Do you remember the event itself, having gone down there? I believe you went with Brandy Green?
yes.
Okay. Did you have a conversation with Officer Serino about why he wanted you down at the station?
Yeah, initially, we were going down to the police department to make sure that he had verified that Trayvon had been identified. Detective Serino didn't bring me to the station. I actually went to the station myself.
Okay. With Miss Green?
Correct.
And at some point, you did go back to his sort of office cubicle area and listen to some tapes, is that correct?
Correct.
My understanding is, from my knowledge of the discovery, was that you listened to a number of tapes, one of which was the tape that we're identifying as the Lauer 911 call, correct?
Yes.
And he did play that for you?
Yes.
And were you listening to it as he played it for you?
Yes.
Understand that it was difficult to listen to. It included the shot that ended your son's life, correct?
Yes.
At the end of that tape, do you recall Officer Serino asking you whether or not you could identify your son's voice?
Not those exact words, but something to that nature, yes.
Okay. Do you recall the words as best you can recall that he used?
As best as I recall, after he played the tape, he basically just said, "Do you recognize the voice?"
And what was your response?
My response was just simply, tell him that I didn't tell him, no, that wasn't Trayvon. I think the chairs had wheels on them, and I kind of pushed away from the table and just kind of shook my head and said, I can't tell.
So your words were, I can't tell.
Something to that effect, but I never said, no, that wasn't my son's voice.
You heard Officer Serino testify that you said no, correct?
Correct.
And you heard Officer Singleton also testify that she was about 8 or 10 feet, and she heard you say no, or an indication that you acknowledged it was not Trayvon's voice. Is that correct?
Before Officer Singleton even testified, the first time Officer Singleton testified, that was the first time I ever seen her. I had no idea that she was even in the vicinity.
Right, you didn't notice her there, correct?
No.
But you heard her testify that she heard you, correct?
Yes, I heard her testify.
As you were here today.
I heard her testify to that, but I didn't see her in the room.
Okay. Did you ever say to anyone, did you ever ask to hear the tape a second time?
Not at that moment, no.
Did you ever tell anybody that you had listened to a cleaned up version of the tape and were then able to identify the voice on it?
What do you mean cleaned up version?
I'm asking you, sir.
To my knowledge, the tape that I listened to is the same tape that's circulating. That's the only tape I know of. I have no knowledge of a cleaned up version.
Okay. So the question then is, did you ever tell anybody, your attorney or anybody else?
I never told anyone that I listened to a cleaned up version of the tape.
Okay. Or an enhanced version?
I have no knowledge of an enhanced version.
Did you ever tell Sabrina Fulton, your ex-wife, that you had listened to the tape at Officer Serino's desk?
I hadn't told her, no.
Was there any reason why you didn't give her that information?
There was a lot of stuff going on. We had just buried our son. A lot of emotions, and you just don't think of every little detail that you've been through. It was a tragic and still is a tragic time for us. So just to answer your question, did I tell Ms. Fulton that I listened to the tape? No, I didn't. Now, you were at the mayor's office when the tape was played to the entire family, correct? Correct. And you were there as well, listening to the tape? Yes. Did you ever take an opportunity to tell Ms. Fulton or any of the other family members before the tape was played what they were going to hear? No, I didn't. Is there any reason why you didn't advise them of that? I'm sure they were aware of what we were doing at the mayor's office, so there was no reason for me to confirm in fact that we were there to listen to the tapes. And was it at that time in the room with everybody else, or what did you say about the tape when you listened to it that time in the mayor's office? What do you mean, what did I say? Did you acknowledge anything about the tape to anybody? After listening to the tape for maybe 20 times, I said I knew that it was Trayvon's voice. I didn't direct that towards any family members. Matter of fact, I think the family members had started leaving out the room. It was too much for them. They couldn't take it. And I just decided to sit there and listen to it. Had you listened to the tape between the time that Officer Serino played it for you on about the 28th of February and about the 16th of March when you heard it in the mayor's office? No, I listened to it in Detective Serino's cubicle and then again in the mayor's office. Okay, no time in between? No. Okay. Have a moment, Your Honor? Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Cross.
Mr. Martin, even at this time, is it hard for you to believe that your son is not longer living?
It's very difficult to believe that Trayvon's not living.
Okay.
As I said over and over, that was my best friend in life, and to have him gone is tragic.
You were asked two areas that I want to cover with you that Mr. O'Mara asked you about. The 911 call that you heard, or the calls, the recordings that you heard at SPD, or Sanford Police Department. You remember going there?
Yes.
Now, in terms of this jury understanding the context, that your son was killed late evening Sunday, February 26th. And you would have gone over to the Sanford Police Department the morning of the I believe it's the 28th. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And I believe also you really found out your son was dead at some point after the 27th. Is that true? That
Correct.
Monday?
Yes.
Okay. And was it still hard for you to believe that your son was dead?
It's still hard to this day that he's dead.
Okay. And officers had come to your house, I believe, on the 27th and told you that your son was dead, right? First, they wanted to verify that that was your son, in terms because he didn't have a ID with him, so they wanted for you to verify that he was the person that they found out in the courtyard of that retreat at Twin Lakes where Brandy Green lived, right?
Correct.
Okay. And I gather you went and got a picture of your son just to show them who your son was, or did they show you a picture of the person that at that time was just described as an unknown person out of the courtyard? They showed you a picture of a body there on the ground, correct?
Check, Your Honor, may we approach?
Yes.
All right, proceed, Your Honor. Mr. Martin, I was asking you about the 27th. Detective Serino, or Investigator Serino, had come and showed you a photograph. Is that correct? And you identified it as being your son, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Now we move to the 28th, where they asked you to go down to the police station, correct?
Correct.
And you go down with fiance at the time, Brandy Green, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And at that time, they played several recordings to you, correct?
Yeah, they played a series of the 911 calls.
Okay. And these were calls where neighbors that had called in regarding what you now knew was the death of your son, correct?
Correct.
Right. And the recordings were of people calling and explaining that somebody had been shot, and I'm sure you listened to the person now identified as Ms. Gordyka, the lady who went hysterical in the 911 call. You were listening to all that, is what I'm saying.
To my recollection, I don't think Detective Serino played each call in its entirety.
Okay,
He played some of the, to my knowledge, he played some of each call leading up to the last call with the fatal shot.
all right. So they played the call then of the cries for help, and then you actually hear a shot, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And am I safe to assume that you still at that time were in denial, in the sense of not wanting to believe that your son was dead?
Correct.
Okay. And this was an emotional time for you, would that be fair to say?
Very emotional.
I must object and refer to the
Then give
court's,
me your,
your previous ruling.
okay, we're now on to the day of the phone calls being played overruled.
This was a very emotional time for you while this was going on, in terms of, I'm talking about the day the recording was played for you at the Sanford Police Department, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And you listened to the recording, and as you stated, described to the jury, you pulled your chair back in disbelief that you were actually listening to voices for help, and also, more importantly, also a shot.
Correct.
You realized that that was the shot
That killed my son, yes.
Did you really know what to do at that point?
No, my world was from that point until today, my world has just been turned upside down.
Okay. And let's focus on that day. Then, after you heard the cries for help, or the recording that's been referred to as the Lauer recording, and then also the shot, at that same time, or right there, Investigator Serino asked you about the recording, if you could recognize the voice, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And I'm assuming that was difficult for you to even contemplate identifying or not identifying the voice, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And as best you could, you attempted to answer Investigator Serino, is that true?
Yes.
Okay. Now, as was pointed out, there was a lot of commotion in that recording, wasn't there? The yells for help, the person calling, and then most importantly, the shot too. How,
Yeah.
in terms of your mind, what was going through your mind, can you describe through your jury what was going through your mind when you were listening to that?
Basically what I was listening to, I was listening to my son's last cry for help. I was listening to his life being taken. And I was trying to come to grips that Trayvon was here no more. It was just tough.
And as Mr. O'Mara pointed out, subsequent time you were present when that recording was played again at the mayor's office. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And I believe your former wife, Ms. Fulton, was present, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And I think you said you wanted to listen to it. Did you listen to that recording and then other recordings at that time too?
I can't remember if it was all of the 911 calls or was it just that last 911 call. But I do remember that I took whole control of the mouse or the clicker or whatever it was that they had, and I was able to rewind that same tape over and over again.
Did you want to, I guess, hear your son's voice over and over? Did that bring you any comfort, I guess, is what I'm trying to ask?
Object again, and same relevancy objection as before, and the court ruled on.
Overruled.
May I have the question read back with the further argument? There's
No, I'll be glad to rephrase the question.
Okay, thank you.
You were playing that recording over and over. You were still dealing with this?
Yes,
His death?
Yes.
Now, it was sometime in March. It was later. It wasn't like days later. You were still having to deal with his death?
Correct.
Okay. And you played it, you said, did you actually write down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or you're estimating you played it at least 20 times?
I'm estimating that I played it maybe 20 times.
Okay. And you played it over and over, why? Were you trying to deal with this, or why were you doing that?
Wasn't as much as I was trying to deal with it. I was just trying to figure out on the night of February 26, 2012, why did the defendant get out of his vehicle and chase my son?
And you weren't there when it happened, correct?
Correct.
And this recording, I guess, is one of the last things in terms of hearing the voice and the shot. You were trying to, as best you can, figure out what happened or why it happened?
Yes.
Thank you, sir. No further questions.
And you redirect?
Yes. Do you believe that the police lied when the two officers said that you said no about it being your son?
Objection, Your Honor, is improper about what somebody else is saying.
Foundation question for another one, Your Honor. I think it's necessary.
Well, you have to rephrase your question because it's not proper to
Okay.
have a witness comment on another witness.
I'll do it this way then. Did you ever instruct your attorney, Ben Crump? You didn't have Ben Crump when you listened to the tape on the 27th, or the 28th, did you?
No.
He was not your attorney at that point?
No, it wasn't.
Later, did you instruct him to say that the police lied when they said that you couldn't tell, when they said that you had said no about it being your son's voice? Did you instruct your lawyer to say that?
I never instructed anyone to say anything.
You never instructed Ben Crump to say that the police had lied about that?
I never instructed anyone to say anything.
Did you instruct your lawyer, Ben Crump, to say that the audio has since been cleared up and now you can hear it better?
No, I didn't.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you. May Mr. Martin be excused?
Yes, Your Honor. Subject to recall, obviously.
Okay, Mr. O'Mara, may Mr. Martin step down?
Certainly.
Okay, thank you, sir. You may step down. Call your next witness, please.
Chief Bill Lee, Your Honor.
Okay.
You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
You may inquire.
Thank you, Your Honor. Afternoon, sir. State your name, please.
My name is Billy Ray Lee, Jr.
And on February 26, 2012, what was your occupation?
I was the chief of police for the city of Sanford.
You're no longer in that position?
No, sir.
When did that end?
June 22nd, 2013. 2012, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Were you then chief of police during the initial investigation stages of the case that brings us here today, State versus George Zimmerman?
Yes, sir.
If you would just tell the jury a little bit about your background in law enforcement.
I have 30 years of law enforcement experience. I started at the Seminole County Sheriff's Office as a road patrol deputy in 1982. I was promoted through the ranks to the position of captain. I retired in 2009. At that rank of captain in charge of our Special Operations Division and Emergency Services Division. 9 years of that experience was in investigations, 5 years as an investigator, 4 as a supervisor.
And where'd you grow up?
I was born and raised in Sanford.
It's your hometown?
Yes, sir.
Did becoming chief of Sanford Police Department then be sort of a pinnacle in your career for its law enforcement?
Yes, it was.
How long were you with Sanford PD as its chief?
I'm sorry,
How long were you with Sanford PD as its chief?
from May of 2011 to June of 2012.
Did you say that you came out of retirement in order to take that position?
I retired from the Seminole County Sheriff's Office and took a position with Seminole State College as their director of the Center for Public Safety. We provided training, certificate training in the areas of law enforcement, corrections, firefighting, and paramedic and EMT services, and also a 2-year degree program in each of those disciplines.
And were you then sort of recruited from that teaching position to get reactivated in law enforcement as the chief of Sanford PD?
That position came available while I was still at the sheriff's office, and I applied for that.
Particular to the this case then, I presume that you were you hands-on, or were you just in a supervisory role over the investigation with the George Zimmerman case?
I was in a supervisory or administrative role at the police department.
But did you have particular focus on this case as well as time went on from February 26th during the time that you still had involvement in the case?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Did that also include the playing of a 911 call for the Martin family members? Were you aware of that decision? And I want to focus you at this point, simply were you aware that that decision had been made, that the tape was going to be played for the Martin family?
My recommendation was that the 911...
I want to be careful a little bit. That's why I focused the question. I don't want to spend a lot of time dealing with the decision to play the tape. I want to focus once that decision was made, we'll talk about then that point forward. So you are aware, were you not, that a decision was made that the tape would be released to be played to the Martin family. Is that
Yes.
correct? Okay. Once that decision had been made, I want to focus you on the way that the recording was played for the Martin family, okay?
Yes, sir.
So, generally speaking, with your experience in law enforcement, within the context of what we will call lineups, or whether that be a visual lineup or an audio lineup, what are the best practices as to how to handle lineups generally?
Generally, just as in, for example, a photo lineup, you would show that photo array or that piece of evidence to a potential witness in a case individually.
Okay. And what is the purpose of doing it individually rather than in a group?
So their decision is not influenced.
One from the other? One witness influencing another witness?
Yes, sir.
So if in fact you were showing, as an example, a photo lineup to this jury and asked them if they could pick out me, would you do it as a group, as a jury, or would you do it individually, one juror at a time?
You should do it individually.
And the purpose of doing it individually as opposed to a group?
So their identification would not be influenced by others'
Is that
response.
a similar process then to what would be done with an audio lineup?
Should be, yes, sir.
And an audio lineup, similar to a photo lineup, is just having somebody listen to a piece of evidence to see if they can identify anything in that piece of evidence?
Yes, sir.
And that was what was going to happen in this case once the decision was made to play to the Martin family, correct? That it was going to be played for them?
It was my understanding that one member of their family had already listened to that tape. You know, again, my recommendation.
Right, we're going to talk, I want to talk about your recommendation as to anything other than once the decision was made, what was your recommendation as to how the tape should be played for the family members?
It should be played individually.
Do you know the result of how it was played? Was it played individually or as a group?
It's my understanding it was played in a group setting in the mayor's office.
Was law enforcement present?
No, sir.
In your years of experience, how is that normally an event that would be handled by law enforcement?
Yes, sir.
May I have a moment, Your Honor? In this particular case, then, did you ask to be present during the time that the recording was to be played by for the family?
I offered to be present, yes, sir.
And was that accepted?
No, sir.
Were you excluded from the room?
Yes, sir.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you. Cross?
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
The mayor made a decision not to have you in there, is that correct?
I believe I asked the city manager if he wanted me to be in the
Right.
room, and they declined to have me.
City manager was your boss?
That's correct, yes, sir.
And so is the mayor, I'm assuming, too, by virtue of that? or-
In my position, my contract was with the city manager.
Okay, all right. And the recording itself was played in the mayor's office, correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And you weren't, I apologize, did I interrupt you?
No.
Did you finish answering?
I did.
Okay, thank you. And you were not present when the recording was played, correct?
I was not present in the mayor's office, no,
I
sir.
think you were in the same building, but not in the mayor's office when it was played.
That's correct.
Did I have that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, you were asked about the lineup, and just so the jury knows, in case they haven't heard of a lineup, what you're talking about is you don't want to have a suggestive, in other words, you don't want to have, normally a lineup includes 6 photographs, right?
Yes, sir.
And you have a person look at the lineup and then identify if they know one of the individuals that did something to them or was a witness or whatever. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And what you don't want to do is show them a photograph, just one by itself, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, also, in a lineup, you don't want a potential witness to a crime to have seen something on TV saying, this is the person, in this case is about this, and here's a photograph. You don't want to do that either, correct?
Preferably not. Yes,
Right?
sir.
Because that would be kind of tainting it, correct?
Correct.
So, in other words, if your experience, you had case and the witness said, oh, I saw the photograph on TV or I heard the voice on TV and it was, they broadcasted regarding the case of Joe. Joe was a suspect. That would be tainted, correct?
Possibly.
Okay. And the reason is because then the person potentially was influenced by the fact that the case dealt with Joe, and they knew Joe was arrested, and there's a photograph of Joe, then that would be tainted, potentially, correct?
Possibly, yes, sir.
And that also would apply to voice, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I mean, voice and photo lineups, you kind of do the same thing, correct?
If you can, yes, sir.
Right, and when you say a voice lineup, you would actually have 6 separate recordings, to be fair in terms of completely accurate. You would have 6 separate voices, and you would have the person actually listen to all 6, and then say, if you did it similar to a photo lineup, you would have a person then say, which one do you recognize, correct?
If you could have 6
Right.
audio recordings that were similar in nature, and when you
Right.
prepare a lineup, there's supposed to be certain characteristics of that person that is the subject of that photo lineup that is similar to all the other photographs in the photo array.
Right, just like if you had a photo array, you wouldn't pick if the suspect had a beard, you wouldn't put one person with a beard and the other people without beards, correct?
That's correct, sir.
Because that would be suggestive, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, and so the jury understands, so in other words, you don't want somebody potentially making a decision based on what they've seen on TV of the photograph or the voice ID versus actually listening to it without having watched anything on TV about the case.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
tape will be read?
Please, just so we're clear on this case, the issue of who was screaming for help on the tape was still an issue that you, as the agency investigating the case, was looking into, correct?
We had, the evidence and testimony that we had gave us an indication of who voice it was screaming for help on the tape, but any other witnesses that we could try to corroborate that would be beneficial in trying to find the truth.
And the indications that you had from the other evidence was that it was George
Objection,
Zimmerman's
hearsay.
voice.
Beyond scope.
Beyond the scope, sustained.
But as to the tape itself and playing it for other witnesses, the potential witnesses are the Martin family themselves, were they not?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And Mr. DeLeon suggested that you'd go out and get 6 voices, but the reality in this case was that you would have done it in a way where each Martin family member would have listened to it themselves and come up with their own opinion as to who they heard, correct?
Objection, Mr. Levy.
Overruled.
That means you can answer.
Can you ask the question again?
Sure.
Thank you.
Within the confines of this case, is the best practice in this case, would the best practice have been to allow, once the decision was made, to have them listen to the tape? Would the best police practices have suggested that you let each family member listen to it individually and get their statement as to what they heard?
If it was for investigative purposes, to let the person that was going to listen to it individually, so that you could get their response without influence.
And that you would avoid the influence of having them all listen to it at one time, correct?
Yes, sir.
And would you agree that in an emotional circumstance such as this one would be, that the possibility for influence is even greater?
It's possible, yes, sir.
Now, you had said that it was the city manager, in response to a question by Mr. DeLoreanda. The city manager doesn't normally make police decisions, does he?
No, sir.
Does he go out and fight fires?
No, sir.
Leaves that to the fire department?
Yes, sir.
Leaves police work to the police department?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Thank you. May Mr. Lee be excused?
Yes, I don't have any further questions.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. You're excused.
We had discussed that this might be a good time to end for the day, and I
Okay.
would ask for that.
Ladies and gentlemen, although you might think that it's early to go for the day, which is 4:27, we have some matters that we do have to take care of outside your presence. So instead of keeping you back in the jury room, I'm going to excuse you for the evening. During the evening recess, you're not to read or listen to any radio, television, or newspaper reports about the case. You're not to discuss the case amongst yourselves or with anybody else. You're not to use any type of an electronic device to get on the internet to do independent research about the case, people, places, things, or terminology. And you're not to read or create any emails, text messages, Twitters, tweets, or blogs or social networking pages about the case. Do I have your assurances that you will abide by these instructions? Yes. Okay, with that, put your notes face down, follow Deputy Jarvis back, and have a good evening.